touchdown confirmed. Perseverance safely on the surface of Mars, ready to begin seeking the sands of past life.
So cold on Mars, so it can get to minus 130 degrees centigrade.
There's some sunlight, there's some gravity. On the other hand, there's nothing to breathe.
Do you have a tendency to panic? Confined spaces don't trouble you?
I'm actually quite comfortable in confined spaces.
If anything happens to this planet, then it's, thank you and good night for humanity. I think it's an excellent idea if people live on space stations, live on the moon, live on Mars.
Hello, I'm Emma Keeling, science reporter. It was the movie Star Wars that made me want to go into light speed and travel into hyperspace. But until we sort that tech out, I guess I can settle for our planetary neighbour Mars. And I'm in good company. Think Elon Musk, think Perseverance, Hope and Tianwen-1. A mission to Mars is for big thinkers, dreamers and adventurers. And as a citizen of the 21st century, I may be lucky because humankind is the closest it's ever been in trying to make it out there. So, do you want to go to Mars on the journey of your lifetime? Excellent. Sit yourself down in Luke Skywalker's seat beside me as I find out if you or I could cut it on the red planet.
Bingo for liftoff. The clock has started.
The scientific achievement of the latest 3 missions to make it to Mars is just incredible. It's taken decades of research and development, and I'm really lucky because I've been able to meet some of those involved. But in this podcast, I want some really basic questions answered about what it might be like to actually go there myself. Could I survive the 7-month journey, plus the 7 minutes of terror it takes to enter, descend and land safely on the planet's surface? Do I have the mental resilience to cope with the isolation and all the psychological challenges I'd be faced with? For a start, how am I going to get there? What kind of spacecraft am I going to need? We've already put man on the moon and launched rovers on the red planet, but what will I need to make it all the way to Mars in one piece?
The difference in lunar missions and Mars missions is the time it takes to get to Mars.
Chris Welch is a professor of engineering at the International Space University in Strasbourg, France.
You can get to the moon in a few days, a few weeks, so you're not spending a very long time in space and you're relatively close to the Earth, so communications is easier and the communications delay is much shorter. Also, you have to design your spacecraft to survive in space for that longer period. It takes 6 months minimum to get to Mars, compared to a few days maybe to get to the moon. Then when you get to Mars and you have to land, Mars doesn't have much of an atmosphere by comparison with the Earth, but it has an atmosphere, and so you have to get down through that atmosphere and get yourself landed on the surface. Whereas on the moon there is no atmosphere, and you can land in a easier sort of way, just using rocket engines.
So we can't rely on just using the same design as was used to get man on the moon. It's got to be more robust.
You do have to have, for instance, an aeroshell to protect you if you're coming into land on Mars. When you enter the atmosphere, thin though it is, there's going to be a lot of heat generated, and your spacecraft has to be protected from that, at least for just the few short minutes that it's going through that upper stage of the atmosphere, whereas you don't have that on the moon. Then inside the spacecraft, yes, they're very similar in terms of the systems that you will have, what is required to make the spacecraft operate. There will be matters such as what is the maximum and minimum temperature that your spacecraft is going to experience. It's a difference between the moon and Mars. Mars has a day-night cycle which is closer to that of Earth. It's almost 24 hours. The moon has a day, if you like, that lasts 4 weeks, so you get very long periods of sunlight, depending where you are on the moon, and very long periods of darkness. So if you're putting something onto the surface, you have to be prepared to last out that long lunar night, which you wouldn't have on Mars.
Okay, so let's say my craft makes it to Mars. Hooray! It's also going to have to stay intact when it gets there, and hopefully get me back. I know the conditions on Mars are completely different to Earth, and it's an extremely inhospitable planet. Chris told us it doesn't have much of an atmosphere, the radiation is extreme, plus there are dust storms and it's freezing. I know, sounds great, doesn't it? Abby Hutty works for Airbus Space and Defence and spends a bit of time in the Mars Yard in Stevenage, which is one of several places in the world that has created a simulation of what the Mars surface might be like. Think giant yellow sandpit with a few rocks and a long photo of Mars down the back wall that Curiosity rover took. I went to meet Abby there, and she forgot to tell me about the sand and the fact that it stains your shoes, so my once blue boots are now green. But anyway, Abby's the lead structural engineer on the ExoMars rover project that's going to be sent to Mars in 2022 by the European Space Agency, and she gave me a look at what my new home might look like.
One of the big things that we struggle with, it sounds silly, but it's the temperature on Mars. It's so cold on Mars, so it can get to minus 130 degrees centigrade at night on Mars, and it rarely gets hotter than about 5 or 10 degrees during the day. But also it fluctuates really dramatically day to night, so that daily fluctuation in temperatures can be really challenging from our structures.
And radiation, I guess, as well.
So on Mars you're not protected with a big magnetic field or a strong atmosphere like we have here on Earth. So that's, for our electronics, is really challenging. It means that you get lots of false positives in your code, bit flips and things like that we have to watch out for, detect and correct for before they do any damage to the signals that we're transmitting.
This is an incredible facility, but how close is this to the conditions on Mars?
So this facility is designed to be visually very close to what we're experiencing on Mars, and that means that when we're developing that autonomous navigation, we're getting the right kinds of images and we've got the right kinds of terrain to navigate through.
So the radiation I'm going to be exposed to sounds pretty nasty. Professor Mark McCaughrean is the Senior Science Advisor at the European Space Agency.
It's probably the biggest problem, in fact, that we face going on long-duration trips. So at the International Space Station, where our astronauts spend 6 months to a year, for example, they are protected by the Earth's magnetic field. So although the radiation rates are actually significantly higher on the space station than they are on the ground, maybe 30 or 40 times higher, it's still within limits, so to speak. But as soon as you go above the what we call the Van Allen belts, which trap radiation and the magnetic field blocks radiation, you're completely exposed to two sources of radiation. One is the stuff coming from the sun, the high energy particles, and you can mitigate against that partly by going at a time when the sun is not very active, so solar minimum. You always have to be careful because the sun can have an eruption and chuck out a whole bunch of high energy particles. And so anything that you do on your way to Mars, you need a lifeboat effectively on board, or a shelter. You need a place to go and hide if a solar storm passes over you.
Wow. I am going to need more than factor 50 sunscreen to survive this trip. So just how much time is going to be safe for an astronaut heading to Mars, Mark?
You're not going to turn around and come back immediately, because the way the planets line up, you will have to stay on Mars for quite a while, for a year and a half or so, and then come back on another half-year journey. Now, to answer the question, in that total journey and stay on the surface of Mars, you're going to absorb about 1 sievert of ionizing radiation. Now, that's all very technical. What's a sievert? A sievert is 1 joule per kilogram. So actually, one way of thinking about that's the same energy as Serena Williams hitting a tennis ball at you. If you're an average-sized person, she'll give you about 70 joules of energy in that tennis ball. If you're a 70-kilo person, that's 1 joule per kilo. You think, well, I could survive that. That's just a tennis ball being hit at me. But it's ionizing radiation. And ionizing radiation, very high-energy radiation, breaks the DNA down. And so, in fact, that 1 sievert that you'll absorb during your Mars mission is enough to raise your chances of contracting fatal cancer by more than 5%. And that's the limit that we set on these things. We sort of, try to mitigate against sending our astronauts to Mars and then having them come back with cancer. So that's really at the limits. It's not definitely going to kill you, but it's not going to be great for you either. So that's why we really need to work hard on these shelters to avoid the solar radiation and minimize the radiation we absorb on the surface. Because on the surface of Mars, it's lower than in space, but it's actually about the same as you get on the International Space Station. The atmosphere of Mars is very thin. It provides some shielding, but not as much as you get on Earth.
I have to say, Mark, you are rapidly putting me off wanting to go, but I am made of strong stuff. I am a New Zealander, and I am still determined to make my mission. What's going to happen to my body spending time on the red planet? How will that be affected? And please tell me I'm not going to shrink, because I'm 5'4" and I can't afford it.
Well, some of the things are fairly straightforward, actually. It's a coincidence, but Mars has the same day as the Earth, more or less. It's actually about 40 minutes longer. And so you'd be fine on Mars. Most people would be fine. It's not like it's going to completely mess with your head having, just a 5-hour day or something. It's 24 hours plus 40 minutes. So that bit's fine. Sunlight on Mars is fainter than it is on Earth because it's further away from the sun, and it's roughly 40% of the amount of sunlight that you would get on the Earth. But because Mars has very few clouds, just some very high thin cirrus, it's always sunny.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm also guessing it's going to have a very different gravity to what we have here on Earth.
The gravity is also about 40% of what we have on Earth. So Mars is a very small planet compared to Earth. People tend to think, oh, Mars, Earth, same. No, Mars is actually quite a small planet and it has less gravity. But that's okay. You'd hop around, bounce around. You'd probably be pretty good at volleyball and good at long jump and high jump. But it's not going to have the same problems we think as microgravity. Space station astronauts have all sorts of problems to do with bone loss and so on. And we don't think that's going to be so much of a problem at all on the surface of Mars. Of course, your journey there and back, that's a year of exposure to microgravity, probably. And so there's lots of work going on. For example, can you have on board your ship going to Mars, could you have a small centrifuge on board that once a day you go in there, get 10 minutes of really high speed spinning, which creates artificial gravity, and that triggers the bones maybe into making more bone mass. You might not need to be under gravity the whole time, but triggering it occasionally might work. So we're doing experiments on that right now.
High-speed spinning, I like the sound of that. Of course, if I'm planning my trip after Tianwen-1 and Perseverance rovers have done their time on Mars, it's going to be so much easier to make some good decisions about what my craft's going to need. It's got to cope with the extreme cold. The average temperature is minus 60 degrees Celsius, but as Abby and Mark told me, it can be minus 130 at night. The thin atmosphere is a mixture of carbon dioxide with some water, so I'm going to need something to create oxygen so I can breathe. Whatever I'm planning on wearing is going to be really important. So I don't think jeans are the go-to in a Mars wardrobe. Damn it.
This suit, it is a mix of Kevlar and Hanox with a reflective and conductive coating on the outside.
I'm talking Mars-friendly clothing with Dr. Robert Wild, who's been fitted into a spacesuit by a very patient team at the Austrian Space Forum in Innsbruck.
The reflective coating helps keep the heat load down because we're going to Mars-like environments on Earth that tends to be deserts, and so if you have a lot of sun, you don't want to heat up too quickly.
You'll be cooking in there.
Yeah, exactly. So this definitely helps with that.
So this is 3 hours.
Yeah, with a really fast and trained team, it can be a little bit faster, but that's about the time it takes.
So patience, that's a big part of being an astronaut, is it?
Well, it's a big part of everything, I think. Also a scientist, yeah.
The team meticulously work through a checklist. Why have you got the supports here? Is that, you're going over rocky terrain, that's to keep your legs?
No, actually. So when you're in a real spacesuit, in an area of low pressure on the outside, you have air pressure on the inside so you can breathe. And that makes the suit act a little bit like a balloon, right? It balloons out. And that means that whenever you move, you're working against that air pressure. You're pulling against this balloon. And so it restricts your movement, and that's what we have here in order to simulate that restriction, this is actually pulling my legs straight, just like it would be in a real spacesuit.
Dr. Wild is what's known as an analog astronaut, someone who's trying to find out what it's like to carry out activities up in space from the safety of Earth by holding himself up in confined spaces in extremely hot or cold deserts. Oh, sounds like fun. With gravity only 38 to 40% of that on Earth, a 50 kg suit will only weigh 19 kilograms on Mars. And that means it'll need to be weighted. So luckily, Dr. Wild's boss at the Austrian Space Forum, Dr. Gernot Groner, has been giving Mars-friendly space attire a lot of thought.
We're working on our second generation of spacesuits. It's called Serenity, and it's a follow-up system to the Aouda, which we've been working right now. It's a totally new generation, new game. It's like comparing a Ford T model against an electrical car nowadays or so. So what we're seeing here is a suit which is based upon 10 years of development of a predecessor model, which has advanced electronics, new power systems, new ventilation systems. It is what we call a rear entry suit, which means you don't need an airlock anymore. You basically attach the suit to the wall of the spacecraft, you step in from behind with an open life support backpack basically, you close the backpack, you decouple and you're outside basically. That means you are mitigating the dust problematics, that you're not bringing in any dirt when you can return from an extravehicular activity. It has many advantages, also disadvantages, but that's what we're hoping for.
So I'm definitely going to try and mitigate my dust problems. If I'm going to have a suit like Dr. Wild's for my Mars adventure, I need to protect my lungs from the very fine layer of iron oxide dust. That's what gives Mars its reddish colour. I'm thinking a very, very bad day on a windy beach where the sand gets into your mouth and eyes. Phew, one problem down, just a few thousand to go. Now, I've also been assuming, maybe incorrectly, that one of the Mars space missions might actually take me on as a potential astronaut, despite my, let's say, maturity. I'm guessing you've got to be very smart and very fit, and able to give up whatever's going on in your life for over, a year or more at a time? Let's ask Dr. Robert Wild. I know he's got a PhD in physics and is an advanced diver who doesn't mind hearing himself breathe or spending long periods of time in confined spaces.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
How do you cope under pressure?
How do I cope under pressure? I try to do the best I can. And I realize that, if for some reason I do make a mistake or there's some problem, I shouldn't be too hard on myself, because if there's that much pressure, then it's difficult. And so, you can only give what you can, and you have to be okay with that. And then as long as you have that mentality, I think you tend to perform better while you're under pressure.
Do you have a tendency to panic?
Not that I know of.
Confined spaces don't trouble you?
I'm actually quite comfortable in confined spaces. Caves and such, I kind of find very exciting.
Anything scares you?
Probably some things scare me, but I haven't really found a pattern.
It will come as no surprise that astronauts undergo extensive training. They have to be among the brightest and the best just to be selected. Then, once on board, they have to undergo numerous physical and mental tests to see if they have the inner fortitude and the right mindset to survive a 7-month journey in a claustrophobic spacecraft. Okay, so let's say I managed to get through the training and I've made it to Mars. I know what you're thinking, but anyway, go with me here. Where am I going to live when I get there? This is where the real fun sets in. Think grand designs in space. One man who has been giving a lot of thought to what a Mars habitat is going to need is architect Xavier de Castellia. Maybe we should call him Astro Architect.
There we go.
This is lovely and cosy. Actually, it's got a real sort of Japanese feel to it.
Well, that's maybe because we used the flooring, as you see, is bamboo.
Oh.
And you might think, well, why you bring all bamboo to Mars? Well, we're not. We're actually thinking of growing bamboo on Mars, right? So we're not going to grow plants to feed ourselves, because for that you need masses of space. But maybe we can grow bamboo to build stuff or to create finishes.
And now, you were talking about space saving before. This is not space saving, it's an enormous piece of furniture.
Yeah, I know. Light and compact. That's not light and compact, right? But you know what? We're not going to bring this to Mars. We're going to print it on Mars. Reason is because our astronauts on Mars, they will have lots of waste material from packaging, from food, from science experiments. So why not use that, recycle it, and print stuff out of it? For example, your furniture.
Wow, that's a lot of food packaging.
Well, the more they eat, the more they do science, the more furniture they can get.
Hooray!
Right?
Another reason to eat. That's
Yeah.
brilliant. Okay, and look, you've got a lovely view here as well.
Yeah.
Even though we're sort of looking at a desert, this actually, because we're looking sort of at the other pods, it sort of makes it feel a little more sort of community.
What you're looking really at is a courtyard. The courtyard is there for a very important reason, because we'll get indirect light in, you get some light from Mars, but you don't get direct sunlight in. You see, the sunlight doesn't really hit us. And that's important, because on Mars, direct sunlight means gamma radiation and is deadly. But we still want to have that view out, see somebody else in another pod.
So obviously, you know, limited with space,
Yeah.
so you had to be clever.
Absolutely. We have this idea of a radial racking system where it can be anything. It can be a kitchen, but it can also be a wardrobe, it can be a workshop or a lab. And the way to save space is that they are movable. So they're movable racks, and suddenly we open up our lab space. Do some geology, Martian geology, or use a workshop. We've got a 3D printer here, and once we're done with that, then I go out, and when I want to use my wardrobe, I just kind of open this up
So
again.
work's finished, done for the day.
And there we go. I get my clothes.
Get your clothes out,
yeah.
and then bit of cooking.
So we can use so much more space and so much more usability out of this pod by doing this.
So what's your favourite part of this
For me,
design? Yeah.
it's really sitting in this big sofa and just looking at the rest of the Martian landscape.
It's a beautiful sight. Xavier's passion for space exploration and the Red Planet is palpable when you meet him. No surprise that he entered NASA's 3D printed habitat competition and spent several years working on his design, thinking about all the intricate details. And what did he come up with? Well, it's a circular structure of lightweight inflatable pods, which will be able to withstand the radiation on Mars. He was inspired by designer Raymond Loewy, who helped design Skylab, the first United States space station launched in 1973. He made it more human-friendly by introducing colour and some home comforts, like a table. I mean, I know, a table, thinking of that as a comfort, but there you go in space. That's a comfort.
So you might think, well, it's a table. What's interesting about that? When the original design, the astronauts would just had a little flap that comes out of the wall where they could have their meals on, and they weren't even located together. They were just in other parts of the station. And you were thinking like, well, what about humans having a conversation over a meal? See how that day was. Second thing he did, and it's quite astonishing, he put a window in Skylab. Because in the original Skylab, the engineers did not put a window in because they thought, well, it's more risk. But imagine going around Earth for weeks or months and not seeing an amazing view of Earth. That is just beyond my belief.
I completely agree with Xavier. If I'm going to be on Mars for months and months, actually that could be years, I certainly need to be able to look back at Earth, although I probably won't be able to see it. But anyway, I mean, it all looks great and exciting, but how do you get all the materials for the habitat to Mars? It sounds like a logistical nightmare, even for engineers and scientists who normally relish a challenge.
That's quite problematic getting stuff to Mars. First of all, the tricky bit is getting it off Earth, in Earth orbit. What you need to do is you need to launch the cargo, fuel, and the rocket engine. So all that gets into orbit, bit by bit, and gets assembled in orbit. So these things are assembled in orbit, Earth orbit. It would be too heavy to get it up, right? But all of them are done by a separate rocket. So these are all the rocket launches that you need. Then bring it all together in space, and then you're off to Mars.
Well, with that fabulous design, I'm really going to enjoy my new home on Mars. And if, as Elon Musk predicts, there's going to be 1 million human beings living on the planet from the 2060s, I'm going to have to put my running shoes back on. But some of the scientists I've been speaking to aren't so convinced human settlements are such a great idea.
I think there's a lot of science fiction dreaming going on there. There's a lot of wish fulfillment.
Let's hear once more from Professor Mark McCaughrean at the European Space Agency.
The way I look at it is, if anybody who says they want to go and live on Mars should go and spend 6 months in Antarctica and then 6 months in the Atacama Desert, but take away all the oxygen that you have, take away most of the water you have, and then live underground in those places because there's no protection from radiation on Mars. And then after all of that, say, well, is that where you really want to spend the rest of your life? Because you're not going to be zipping there backwards and forwards. You're going to go there, and that's going to be where you're going to be, and you're going to live in a small box in a deeply inhospitable place. So for me at least, I think there's a lot of interest in the sense, wouldn't it be amazing to put your feet on another planet? But I think in practical terms, the journey itself is incredibly difficult. Being there, well, it's a horrible place to go and live. And there is this other aspect which I think is a bit strange in some of these discussions, that people say, well, it's a lifeboat for the Earth. We're destroying the Earth. Let's go to Mars and save the human race in some way. And this is just utter nonsense. There's almost nothing we can do to the Earth that will make it less hospitable than Mars will ever be. So it's a strange thing, and I think when people talk about it in terms of hope and dreaming and inspiration, I think you could actually apply exactly the same words to saving the environment here on the Earth, making it a place where billions of people can live much more comfortably and sustainably than on a planet hundreds of millions of kilometers away where only tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands could live. So it's not something I'm a big fan of, let's put it that way.
So Mark's not keen on the idea of actually going to live on the Red Planet. But what about Chris Welch from the International Space University, who I spoke to at the beginning of this podcast?
I'm a big fan of human spaceflight. Elon Musk and I don't share many attributes. I have to say he's a little bit more wealthy than I am for a start. But he and I both agree that it's not a good idea for all the humans in the world to live on one world. If anything happens to this planet, then it's thank you and good night for humanity. So he says, and I would agree, that humanity needs to be a transplanetary species. We need to have human beings living permanently off the Earth in case anything happens to the Earth. So as a matter of longer-term species survival, I think it's an excellent idea if people live on space stations, live on the moon, live on Mars, live on asteroids, anywhere in the solar system. Although, I think it's going to take us a while to get there.
So Mars may be a good backup plan, but we haven't really thought about the impact of what we human beings might do to the Red Planet if we decided to make it our second home. Janet D. Stemwedel is a professor of philosophy at San Jose State University. Her work focuses on science and ethics.
Even if we decide that putting humans on Mars might make some sense, then we have to think about, okay, which humans? What does that mean to say some humans get to go settle Mars? Is this in anticipation of bringing all the Earthlings to Mars because we somehow used up this planet in a really unfortunate way? My guess is probably that's not what the folks who are hot to colonize Mars have in mind, which means we need to have a discussion about why we think it's okay to take some people to this brave new frontier and leave a whole mess of people here to deal with how we didn't do as well with the planet we started with. And colonization should maybe remind us that some of these missions, some of this, we're leaving the old place and going to the new place, has not worked out well for everyone. Missions of colonization are basically going to enrich some people and are going to leave other people worse off. It feels to me like this is a place where our science doesn't necessarily help us to do the thing we really need to do, which is to figure out how better to share a world with each other.
Elon Musk seems pretty confident there will be a settlement on Mars, but I have to admit, all that radiation, confined spaces, the dreaded red dust, I'm not sure how humans will survive the trip there mentally and physically. And then you'd have to stay, for good. No more trees, blue sky, the sights and smells of Earth. We have so much to fix here on Earth, problems and crises we have created. I'm sure humans will step foot on Mars one day. Humankind's curiosity and determination will make sure of that. But I think I'll sit this one out, leave it to the rovers and robots, and keep watching reruns of Star Wars. And perhaps we should leave the final word to the legendary astronomer Carl Sagan. Several months before his death, he composed a future message to future explorers of Mars.
I don't know why you're on Mars. Maybe you're there because we recognize that if there are human communities in many worlds, the chances of us being rendered extinct by some catastrophe on one world is much less. Or maybe we're on Mars because of the magnificent science that can be done there. The gates of the wonder world are opening in our time. Or maybe we're on Mars because we come, after all, from hunter-gatherers, and for 99.9% of our tenure on Earth, we've been wanderers, and the next place to wander to is Mars. But whatever the reason you're on Mars is, I'm glad you're there, and I wish I was with you.